Nothing is the same anymore. People's lives are not what they had imagined they were going to be. Familiar places of comfort, of strength, people can't go to them anymore. No one can gather at the place of worship that had centered their lives. The community watches as even their young people become weary, exhausted. Everything that had seemed full of promise is now so very far away. The Israelites are in exile. That's where we meet the people of Israel in the reading from Isaiah this morning, in exile. Scholars place this section of Isaiah somewhere around 538 BCE. The temple in Jerusalem has been destroyed. Their community is scattered. They weep along the rivers of Babylon as they find themselves in a place entirely unfamiliar to them. People are so tired. They can't see the end of this, can't see how there will be a way back to the life they had before. As this period of exile stretches on and on, they start to forget. They forget their own stories, the way God has taken care of them and provided for them in the past. They forget God's great love for them. It seems to me entirely understandable that in this crisis, people start to think that maybe God isn't paying attention or has actually abandoned them. They say they have been disregarded by God. But the prophet says, no, have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Don't you remember? True, God has stretched out the heavens and created every star in every galaxy. And God knows each of them by name. God is from everlasting, and God's ways are unsearchable. And the prophet insists, what we know of God in our bones, the story that the people of God have told one another over and over and over again, is the story of God's faithfulness. Our Creator gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Yes, in exile and in pandemic, even the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Alongside this promise from the prophet Isaiah, this morning we have this story from the Gospel of Mark. Jesus and his disciples have left the synagogue and they go to Simon and Andrew's house. It doesn't seem that Jesus goes there to perform a healing, but once he arrives, they tell him how sick Simon's mother-in-law is. The gospel writer tells us that Jesus came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. Now, frankly, getting over a fever and hopping up to start serving a bunch of people, a bunch of men, sounds to me exhausting at best. I chafe at the notion that this unnamed mother-in-law is a model of good discipleship generally, or worse, being a faithful woman specifically. And distorted into a tool of oppression, this passage can cause real damage when used that way. But I think, and I trust, that there is actually a lot more going on here. This word, serve, it means serve, yes, and also to minister. We're only at the 31st verse in the first chapter of Mark, and we've already heard this before. After Jesus' baptism, he was driven out into the wilderness. He was tempted for 40 days, and then angels came and ministered to him, served him. The word is diakoneo in Greek. It's where we get the term deacon from. In our tradition, deacons are people who have a special vocation, a calling to service. All of us who follow Jesus the Christ are called to serve, to care for the vulnerable, the sick, the poor, and the hurting. Deacons show us how. Their passion makes Christ and his redemptive love known. I mourn the fact that we don't know more about this woman's story. We don't even get to know her name, much less what her passions were, what she thought of this Jesus who healed her. But I like to imagine that she received his touch as a fulfillment of Isaiah's promise, that God will strengthen those who are weak, that she would run and not be weary. I like to imagine that her heart was full as she stepped back into her vocation. She is, in the text and for us, a model of Christ himself, who told his disciples that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. Again, we lose some of the nuance in translation. We have that Jesus lifted her up, but the Greek tells us that he raised her, the same way that Christ himself was raised from the dead. She experiences the new life that becomes possible for us through the resurrection. How many of us long to host others in our home again, to serve a meal to our friends? I see service in a different way when it is not forced but longed for. What I hold on to here is that the same God who made and named the stars comes into our homes, sometimes even uninvited, and holds our hand. I grab onto the image of hope, of healing and wholeness. I trust that we have not been disregarded, that we will be restored to community, to our passions, to our vocations. It is okay to be weary. It is okay to fall exhausted. I read recently that, in fact, we're collectively hitting a new wall in this pandemic because our fight or flight response, our adrenaline and cortisol regulation system, actually can't handle this kind of prolonged stress. This weekend marks 1 year since the first identified death due to COVID-19 in the U.S. We could not have imagined then the death toll we were facing. Now we are aware that we might have to live for quite some time in this place that does not feel like the life we thought we were promised. But don't give up hope. The prophet's promise is for our time too. Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? God is from everlasting. God does not faint or grow weary. Whether in exile or in illness or in lonely isolation, those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. Take heart. Remember the story of God's faithfulness from generation to generation. Hold fast to those passions you long to step into again. God will yet come to raise you up and lead you into life.